Let me begin by making a few prefatory comments about how I myself and at Hyderabad Urban Lab we think about researching waste. It started actually about a little over 10 years when I started seriously thinking about waste as an academic interest. And it came not so much from an interest in waste itself, but with a certain kind of frustration with the way in which we were doing research. It seemed like a lot of the work that we were doing in our field work, in our readings and so on, we were picking up a lot of bits and pieces and scraps of interesting things which seemed to have somehow something of value, but we didn't know how to string them together. So it occurred to us that what if we begin to think about research itself as a sort of rag picking exercise? Because what does a rag picker really do? The rag picker goes around the city looking for stuff that people have thrown away as something which has no value, finds some kind of value in it, processes it and puts it into circulation so that it becomes meaningful and gains value through that circulation. It gets more and more refined, it gets segregated, it gets circulated, it becomes valuable. So the rag picker, the researcher himself, what if we begin to think of ourselves as rag pickers of a certain kind? What is the stuff that's being thrown out, discarded, not valued, and how do we pick that up? How do we figure out what its value is? How do we bring it back into narratives and discursive spaces where we can somehow turn it into value? Right? That's where the academic imagination, research imagination of rag picking and waste began for me. The political interest in rag picking actually began a little before that. In fact, it started around almost 20 years ago in Hyderabad when the river beautification project started in Hyderabad, and the first thing to have happened was a rag pickers colony which was on the riverbed caught fire at around 4 o'clock in the morning. And the story was that an old woman had set a lamp very close to her foot and kicked it in her sleep, and the lamp fell down and the entire rag pickers colony got burnt and 8 people died. And the story somehow just didn't make any sense to me. It's a rag pickers colony. People know that you leave a lamp light in hot summer, keep it at your foot at night and kick it at 4 o'clock in the morning. It sounds really absurd. So it seemed like something else was going on, that there was a reason why that rag pickers colony had to be moved from there. And it seemed reasonably, plausible that was the case, that there were people who were interested in moving them out, because within half an hour of the fire starting, relief vans were there. People were immediately put into relief vans and taken away to a relocation center. So at that time we started interviewing the rag pickers. How did they come, where did they come from, what families moved in from the villages, what were they doing here, and so on and so forth. And one of the stories that we kept constantly hearing is that हमको गांव से यहाँ इसलिए आना पड़ा क्योंकि गांव में हम सर उठा के खड़े होते हैं तो सर काट देते हैं, यहाँ आके हम सर उठा के जी सकते हैं. That's the reason why we have moved into the city. And this was the easiest point of entry for us because इसमें कोई investment नहीं है. Our estimate at that time was that there were about 1.5 lakh people in Hyderabad who were involved in rag picking, and their mean incomes per day were about 45 rupees. So the estimate was that about 45 lakhs or maybe 60 lakhs per day was the wage earnings of rag pickers in the city. And none of this is just trash that has to be thrown out. It's not a negative value. It has to be taken to some factory from where it enters the formal market. So it seemed like a pretty huge economy about which we really knew nothing at all. So what do we do? How do we study this? Where do we start? So when we started our work in Hyderabad on the waste economy through Hyderabad Urban Lab, because of the structure in which formal research is done, we had to write a proposal. And the proposal was centered around one particular neighborhood called Dholakpur, which is a major hub in Hyderabad for segregating waste. It's an entire municipal ward of about 70,000, 80,000 population. And you walk into the ward, you will see places dealing in metal, plastic, cloth, not so much glass, electronics, huge amounts of electronics waste. And in the middle of it, we found a lot of interesting things that one wouldn't even expect in a waste market, right? So bull penises, for example, processed dried bull penises being exported to China for Chinese medicine. Very secretively done in some corner, nobody knows about it. But when people know about it, they're all surprised and shocked, and it's like a strange thing. There were stories about people whose skills were valued across the place. Right? So there's one man who was introduced to us who is supposed to have figured out how to break the coils of an air conditioner, the copper coils, which are very tightly packed together. They're not easy to separate. And this man apparently figured out the technique of tapping it with a particular kind of hammer and separating all of the coils and so on. And the man, he may be earning the same thing as everybody else, or maybe even less than everybody else, but the guy who knows how to spot gold and silver in a laptop, the guy who knows how to tap the copper coils, they are regarded as ustads, they are regarded as people who are very important, respected, because they know how to do things. The reason why we went to this particular place was because in 2009 there was a major water contamination in the area, an outbreak of colitis. About 10 people died, 1,000 people were hospitalized, and the media was constantly putting out stories saying that all this had happened because there are illegal tanneries operating in the area, there is plastic being processed, and so on and so forth. And the people there kept trying to say that, look, colitis cannot happen because of tanneries, colitis happens because of fecal matter entering drinking water. So why is the media going on about tanneries and plastics and not talking at all about how fecal matter entered into the drinking water supply? That was our key interest, and at some level it also seemed like a fascinating scientific inquiry, because the NGRI did a study in that area, and they said they were surprised that E. coli could actually survive in the presence of heavy metals and at fairly deep levels in the surface of the earth. Because E. coli is an extremely sensitive organism, it just dies. You can't even go 6 feet and find E. coli, it dies. But it survived in the presence of heavy metals, and heavy metals are there in that soil, everybody knows it, because of the tanneries which operated there in extremely ugly competitive times, trying to maintain profit lines. They kept using heavy metals, mainly hexavalent chromium. Right? If any of you have seen Julia Roberts' film, that's the metal, that's the material. It's hexavalent chromium, the most deadly toxic heavy metal which can cause all kinds of problems. We have no idea what the epidemiological burden on that place is. We don't know what the reproductive disorders are. But that's the story. So we walked into the place and we started putting together what the history of that whole place was, because it seemed like there were so many different things which are getting entangled in this place. First thing that was very striking was that the water supply lines are getting mixed up with sewage lines and somehow sucking in sewage, and that has to do with the aging of the infrastructure, it has to do with the difficulty of drawing water, it has to do with the vacuum that's being created in the pipelines because people put up small pumps and suck water out, all these details, and the different communities which are there in it. It's all Muslim population, with a significant amount of Dalit population on the fringes of this whole economy. So what we started doing then was one of the first things we did, and this is where I think the innovative part of our work was, we built an online mapping platform so that we can actually start putting things into a map. We know what starts from where, what comes in from where, and so on and so forth. I'll show you the maps in a moment. And then we started digging through the archival maps of that area to see what was there, what were the land sizes, what are the open spaces available there, is the place really congested, what do the people themselves think about what is going on, and so on. That is where our work in the last 2-3 years started opening up so many different threads of inquiry. And what I want to do is to talk about this in about 4 different pieces. The first piece I want to talk about is the spatial histories of waste. The second piece that I want to talk about is who are the people, right, who are occupying different locations within this structure of spatial history. The third piece that I want to talk about is the changes in the economy and the changes in the work practices and how certain kinds of burden fall on certain bodies at different points of time, right? Where does the burden fall the most? And then I want to talk a little bit in conclusion about what kind of politics or what kind of organization does all of this really suggest, because these workers just do not figure anywhere in the imagination of any of the trade unions in the city. They refer to them at best as the poor, and the poor are not a political constituent, right? They are not people who are capable of politics. They're just outside of that framework completely. You can't organize the poor. You can't make demands on their behalf except asking for some kind of benevolence. And benevolence can only be asked through networks of caste, networks of patronage, so on and so forth. You can't really put pressure in the name of the poor, right? And I'll also talk about how that struggle for searching for some name in which a claim can be made has been going on in some of these places. So what is the spatial history of waste? The longer history is that Dholakpur itself is a place where animal skins and carcasses were processed in the 19th century. I mean, we have actually traced archives of that place going back to 1850s, 1860s, where court cases were being fought between traders who partnered with each other, one in Secunderabad, one in Chennai, and the court does not know whether they have the jurisdiction to decide, because Secunderabad is part of the Nizam's dominions and Madras is the British dominion. Does the British court sitting in Madras have the authority to settle a partnership that was made in Bakaram village in Hyderabad, right? Those were the kinds of struggles that they had. But the general sense that a lot of people in that area have is that Bakaram and the villages around it, outside of Hyderabad city, outside of the Secunderabad cantonment, became the center for dealing with animal skins and bones and so on, because the army needed a lot of this material. And this was a region which was consuming a lot of meat. So the material would be collected there, processed, and big tanneries emerged there. But there were no further forward linkages to any other kind of production. You just process the leather, send it on. The actual production of belts, shoes, so on and so forth happens somewhere else, and that value addition would happen only in the territory that is directly under the control of the British and not in the Nizam's dominion. This only supplies the raw material. Now this is the general understanding of the families which are located in Dholakpur for a very long time, and the stories that they have heard from amongst themselves. Gradually over a period of time, these tanneries required workers of various skill levels, of various social standings and so on and so forth, right? So there are 4 different streams or 4 different communities which emerged there, each specializing in a particular type of material that they were able to process. Large tanning areas, factories were set up there. A lot of Dalit communities also moved in at different points of time to work in the factories, particularly Madiga, the Chamar community in the Hyderabad state. They moved in and started settling down around Bholakpur. They were working in this. Apparently, a lot of the tannery owners provided some of their land for housing these people, so they built some houses around it. The whole thing began to break down in the 90s, when the leather industry itself had changed, the economic reforms had set in. Kuwait was occupied, and it's a completely random story that surprised us when we started talking to people, finding out oral histories. Apparently, the occupation of the Kuwait airport by Iraq destroyed several families in Bholakpur because they were exporting leather through Kuwait to Europe, and the leather got stuck there. And your material is stuck for a month, you're finished. So there are people who completely became workers at the lowest end in the chain in Bholakpur because of that single incident. There are other stories about how the Chinese started entering the market. They had a much better fashion intelligence on what kinds of leather goods are required in the European market. They were able to predict things, they were able to hire higher end designers for their products, and they were using pigskin, something that the Indian leather producers were not able to do with the same kind of ease. So they got pushed out. They didn't have the history of forward linkages until then, so they were not able to do it, whereas Gindi, Ranipet in Chennai were able to do much better. In fact, many of the tannery owners in Hyderabad moved over, or they already had family connections to Ranipet and Chennai and so on. So they moved over there. Some of them moved to the Middle East. But by mid-90s, the tanning actually became very, very difficult in Hyderabad. It had to be shut down. Those who continued were doing a really dirty, heavy industrial chemical oriented tanning for a little while, and then they stopped it. So bit by bit, 1/3, 2/3 of the population had to shift over to other things, and they shifted to dealing with what I sometimes, just for fun, call the skins of commodities that we use, which is the plastic wrappings. They deal in plastic wrappings, and gradually they started figuring out what kind of plastic would be used in what kind of industry. And those knowledge networks and trade networks from the earlier times with leather and so on, and the new entrepreneurial networks that they created since the 90s, then connected them to huge markets across the country. So plastics, sometimes through a little bit of processing in Hyderabad, would go to Bombay. Some of it goes into the textile industry. Some of it comes to Delhi for PVC pipe making. Shoes, footwear comes to Nizamuddin. Other things go to Nagpur, other things go to Kanpur. So everywhere, that entire geography is very, very well organized. They work through these social networks. Some of it is visible, some of them pay taxes, some of them don't. In our reckoning, there are 300 plastic scrap dealers who are taxpayers, 300 who don't pay taxes, they are curb dealers, pretty much like in the stock exchange. There are people who can operate on the floor, and there are people who cannot operate on the floor. So an entire world of people picking up things from hospitals, picking up things from hotels, picking up things from the street, everything became opened up to us. From there, as we started trying to figure out what is going on with these workers, where do they get the material from, the other networks began to open up, which is at the back end you have the kabadiwalas, or the big factories from where you go and pick up. So knowing what can be routinely picked up is an important part of the work. So there are 500 auto trolleys who pan out into the city. They have regular routes. They go to those kabadiwalas and bring the material back to this place. And then you have a number of tea stalls in the neighborhood where people are sitting. They seem like they're just sitting there and yakking away throughout the day, but they are trying to pick up information. Where is waste available? Who is willing to sell? What are the networks that I need to activate to get this thing done? They're trying to figure out all of these things using mobile phones. Once the deal is struck, then they send a trolley or whatever, go and pick it up, bring it back, and then work with it. But what is the structure of this whole thing? You have a large number of kabadiwalas spread out across the city, every street corner. You have people working in these little hubs like Dholakpur, and as we figured that there are many other places. The only difference is that in Delhi you seem to have specialized markets. Plastics happens only in one place, metal happens only in one place. We don't have that much in Hyderabad. The only separation seems to be that automobiles is a separate market, salvage yard. But other than that, almost every material is handed everywhere. The Kabadiwala network, these hubs where the work is done, the rag pickers on the street, and then you have people who have the capacity to store the material, who are larger dealers. They are the ones who can actually hold on to the material for longer time. They are to some extent the price makers. They are the ones who can decide the price, whereas the smaller dealers are the price takers. They really cannot control the price, and the constraining factor for them is the storage space that they have. Because waste, the way it works is I keep buying and I have to sell it out. At some point of time my room is filled. If I don't sell it off, I'm going to be buried under it. So if I have to sell it off, I have to sell it off at whatever price, because my ability to circulate cash is also constrained. And most of them work with something like a lakh and a half in hand, and many of them do keep accounts. They don't show it to you, but about 60,000, 70,000 you spend, you know that you will have to start selling. You will have to start getting rid of it to bring money back in so that you can stay in the market. So your storage space and the money in your hand is the limiting factor, and most people can only get out of that space either through marriage or through some other windfall from somewhere. Within that they figure out small tiny little techniques, right? One of the most exciting thing for us in this work was learning the language of how they do this work. So one of the words that they, when in our early interviews we asked them, so who are the middlemen here? And they said, there are no middlemen. What are you talking about? We are not people who हम दलाल नहीं है, कि दलाल कुछ काम नहीं करता है. Dalal is someone who takes commission from both sides and bears no risk. We are not that. We put in work, we take huge risk, we sometimes get destroyed, so we are businessmen. Please don't refer to us as dalals or middlemen. That's one very clear thing. Another very interesting word that they often use is attach. So the way they explain it to us is that, see, I buy iron, I cannot control the price is controlled by somebody else. I don't make much money. It seems like, why am I doing this stupid thing where I'm making a tiny amount of profit throughout the year? The reason I would do it is that every time I buy iron and steel, it comes in the form of rods, it comes in the form of something else, at the end of which there would be a copper bolt, at the end of which would be a brass bolt. And that bolt is what I take out and put it aside. I call it the attach. 6 months down the line, when I look at it, I have a pile of copper. I sell that. That's what my profit actually comes from. That's where I make money. Right? So this kind of a native intelligence about how the system works and how to work the system is what has been going on there. But who are the people in this? At the top end, you have the Marwadis. That is usually who controls the top level of the market who have the bigger storage space and the bigger access to credit, and these are the kinds of people who can look at the metal prices in London and figure out how the entire market is going to work. The people in Dholakpur can sometimes be smart enough to be able to look at those prices. They know what is going on, but they can't change the rules. They don't have the capacity. At the lower end, you have these smaller dealers who vary from place to place, but in Hyderabad it has been mostly the Muslims. You do have some smaller Marwadis and so on, but it's mostly the Muslims in different places, and with very different histories of migration into the city. And then at one step below that, you have the Kabadiwalas, who come from all kinds of communities, and then you have the rag pickers who bring the material to them. But this is the one part of the story of waste in Hyderabad. The other part of it, which is where we keep mostly talking about municipal solid waste management, is the one that is handled by the government. Right? So what is going on there? We often get questions from people who are working on waste in Hyderabad, who want to provide consultancy, support to the system and so on and so forth, who come and ask us, how much waste do you think Hyderabad produces per day? How much waste do you think each ward produces? We are being told that it is 4,500 metric tons, but nobody seems to be able to give us any kind of disaggregated numbers on that. And each time I hear that, I feel like, oh my God, I'm going back to the old story of what actually happened in Hyderabad. So the story goes as follows. Somebody many years ago did a study, and I think this was in Lucknow, and I think I know the people who've done that study, arrived at this thumb rule that in India, per capita urban waste production is 500 tons per day. Right? And somewhere in the middle of the last decade, Hyderabad city was desperately trying to project itself as the mega city, to access some funding for research. To be a mega city, you have to have a 10 million population. So what we did was to expand the boundaries of the city and make a huge projection on top of what the 2001 census said, and said, so, we have to be 10 million. We're not quite there, but 9 million. And so we have 4,500 million metric tons. That's the number that we came up with. And we have been repeating that number year after year after year. No actual weighing has ever been done. Nobody knows exactly what goes where. But it's not as if we don't know where the waste goes. What happened was, until about 98, 99, the Municipal Corporation of Hyderabad and the 12 municipalities around it each found some piece of land somewhere where they could throw the junk. And in each place, the local population went to court and got an order against the municipality dumping the waste there. One of it was actually inside the forest, so deer park. So the municipal corporation had to stop dumping it there, and then finally they figured that there is one place outside of Hyderabad city, in a small village called Jawahar Nagar, on top of a hill, a 300-acre piece of land. And that history of that land itself was a very, very fascinating story for us. So how is it possible that nowhere else in and around the city you were able to overcome the resistance from the public, but here you are able to do it? The way it happened is that this was land that was under the control of the British, and they gave it to ex-servicemen in bits and pieces as rewards for being ex-servicemen. The government of India continued to do that after independence, giving small bits and pieces to retired army men. Cadastral maps of the area are not easily available because it had never been properly surveyed. They were under the control of the army. precisely for that reason, the place becomes something very, very attractive to several different kinds of people. One group of people that were interested in it are the new migrants into the city who couldn't find a place in the city. They started going there through different kinds of networks of leadership, often from the ruling party themselves, who would settle them. So there are 42 colonies which actually constitute the Jawaharnagar village, and the population is about 2 lakhs. It's a rural panchayat, and there is no agriculture happening there. That's where, because of this enormous fragmentation and lack of any kind of tenure, people were not able to organize and protest against this. The second thing that happened was the government of India was distributing some pieces of land here and there, Army Dental College, Birla Institute of Technology and Sciences, bits and pieces of land, and they were desperate to get the land. They were not in any position to object to this. So the municipality started dumping waste on top of this hill, and nobody noticed it for a long time. From 2008 onwards, all of the city's waste is supposed to have been going there. But in real practice, the structure is as follows. Waste comes from 2 different sources.
Can I ask you a small question? How can you dump over a hill? I mean,
there's a plain surface. They planed off some part of it, but it's an important question. The answer is that they would take it on top of the hill through a route that was cut, pile it up there, and as the hill keeps mounting of waste, you push it over.
Yeah, but it will topple on the other side.
Yeah, it will topple on this hill slope, and there's a lake below, so that's where it goes. That's what they kept doing for a very long time. It's like a disaster site. It's literally like a disaster site. And if people who work there for a week come out and want to kill anybody who comes in their path, I wouldn't blame them. It's a very, very bad experience being there. And that's how most landfills actually are. But this one is a particularly bad one. Now it has changed a little bit because Ramki took control of that, and they made some investments and cleaned up and so on. There are fights going on about rag pickers' rights to go and collect material from there, and that operates in a very different way. This is not like rag picking on the street. A lot of material comes there: dog carcasses, animal carcasses of various kinds, sewage treatment, septic tanks material, sometimes dead bodies, steel, hospital waste, all kinds of things, right? So rag pickers, when they go there, they look around, and under the mound they see something shining, they pull it, and the whole hill comes down. And we have had 3 accidents where people just completely got burnt because they were buried under the waste that came down on them. Third time, the family said, don't even look for the bodies because we don't want to see the bodies after the hill is cleared. That's a different horror story altogether. So where does waste actually come from? It comes from different institutions. So there's a point source: hostels, hospitals, homes, so on. It comes from the street littering. And there are 2 different ways in which waste comes out onto the street. The waste from homes is collected by a system that was put in place in 95, which also changed the system of work on the street littering scene as well. When I start talking about the work practices and how they've changed, I'll come to that in some detail. From there, it goes to the local dump site or the bigger dumpster. From there, it goes to what is called a transfer station. From the transfer station, it is transferred to larger trucks, and from there it is supposed to go to the landfill. That's the journey of waste. From the source to the garbage bin, to the dumpster, to the transfer station, from the transfer station to the landfill. Okay. Now, in the Municipal Corporation of Hyderabad, we have 3 transfer stations. In the surrounding municipalities, they don't call them transfer stations because they had their own small little landfills. And they continue to call them as the dumping yards. So a lot of waste still gets dumped there because the integration of those 12 municipalities has not happened in any systematic way with the main city. So that geography of waste and waste handling and so on continues to be quite differentiated. Who are the people coming into this work? You find very, very different pathways through which people come. Primitive tribal groups, begging communities which are on the fringes of agricultural economy, and as the agricultural economy begins to tumble down, they come into the city, and this is the economy into which they can easily slip in. We have not seen any Bangla speaking rag pickers from Hyderabad, but we are hearing that a lot of them are in Bangalore, and they are coming from districts like Murshidabad, very, very difficult areas. And the pattern that I think this indicates is that when people move from already being on the fringes of a local economy, whether because of climatic reasons or because of economic reasons, whatever, when they move into the city, they move into the margins of it, they move into the really, really dregs of that economy. So you find people coming from the KBK region in Orissa to Hyderabad and becoming pretty much bonded laborers in the brick kilns around Hyderabad city. 2 lakh workers everywhere. Primitive tribal groups who are not even like the regular tribal groups, who have reservations, who have been through 1 or 2 generations of schooling, education, get pushed out of the forest, they come into the city and they become rag pickers. Boya communities, other tribal communities, SC communities in really, really violence-prone areas, they come into the city and they get into this work. Children who are run away from families, they get into this. So the most vulnerable, who have no clear pathway of getting anywhere in the city, get into this work, and they do make a fair amount of money. A fair amount of money, I do not mean that they're making decent wages, but 45 rupees in 97, 98 was a substantial amount of money. It means that you have cash in your hand to spend, and that actually produces a particular kind of subjectivity. Right? The workers who are engaged in this kind of work know that one of the things that they have, the only thing that goes for them is the money that they can pick up on the street at the end of 6 hours or 8 hours, and they can transact in that. They're not easy to unionize, they are not easy to organize, they're not easy to interview and talk with at any great length, because I mean, unless you know how to work with them, right? You can't really walk in there and say that I want to win your trust. First question they would ask you is, so what are you going to get out of this? Show me, be transparent, because you're going to get something out of this, and only then I will transact with you. Otherwise, no. That's the kind of situation. You find that very often the people from these communities are very easy to be, they're open for a certain kind of sexual economy in the city. They get drawn into that. Which also happens in the lower ends of construction labor. They are also, precisely because of the location in this economy, looking for different kinds of possibilities of finding opportunities. I mean, what would it take for someone to look at something shining under a heap that is enormously dangerous and go and pull it out? Right? It's that kind of a location in the city's economy. So what are the changes in the work practices which seem to have produced this kind of a situation? From 95 onwards in Hyderabad, the municipality has gradually begun to say that sanitation, handling waste is not the municipality's work. It's not something that we know how to do. And I have heard so many municipal engineers say this, कि ये हमारा काम नहीं है, हम नहीं कर सकते हैं. And those of us who are old enough to to think that municipalities are born to do sanitation work, we're shocked, right? But otherwise it seems like they're saying something very genuine. Ye humko nahi aata. It's not our work. So what they started doing is, in the first place, they decided that the regular sanitation workers in the municipal corporation will have to be seriously outnumbered by contracted and outsourced workers. So at the moment, I think it's something like 25% of sanitation employees in Hyderabad are employees of the municipal corporation. 75% are outsourced workers. They don't even exist in the government's roles. They exist in the spreadsheets of an IT company, which is the outsourcing company, which is also tasked with monitoring and keeping tabs on who is coming to the work, who is cleaning the road, who is not cleaning the road, and so on. This happened over a period of time, and the contracts and the documents that were written to make this happen are another bizarre story. The first round of contracts were all written up as these were self-help groups who were volunteering to clean the city. So it's essentially all of them have been converted from workers into volunteers. That's what the contract says. So you're basically paying them a consideration, an honorarium for doing the work. You're not paying them wages. They don't have any workers' rights. So if you give them a provident fund, they should be thankful because the government has, deemed to give them a provident fund. It's not their right. If they get knocked down on the street by a vehicle, it's not something that they can claim as injury at workplace. None of those workers' rights exist. And I think that model has expanded to other places as well. Bombay really tried to do it, and I think they've managed to do that. In Bangalore, there are huge fights over this. Delhi, I think, is something similar is going on. What does this mean for safety, incomes? Why do people do this work? It's the same story also with garbage truck driving. All of the truck drivers make 9,000 rupees a month. And because that money is not adequate, they steal diesel. And because they steal 3 to 6 liters of diesel every day, and they know that their superiors are stealing much more, but they're scared to expose what the superiors are stealing because they're scared that they will be caught. They have no idea that 9,000 rupees is no decent pay, and that they can actually make a claim like that because that category or that position as workers is completely disappeared. That imagination is gone. A lot of the regular employees of the municipal corporation themselves have subcontracted their work. They don't do the work. I have my job, but I hire someone else to do the job at 4,000, 5,000 rupees. I draw the regular salary. I go and do some other business. This is the basic structure of the municipal sanitation work. What happens on the ground is that because of this pressure to keep the costs low, safety is completely gone for a toss. Whether you're looking at sewage cleaning up, whether you're looking at garbage handling, whether you're looking at hygiene, everywhere it's gone. That cost cutting, especially through controlling labor process, has resulted in a major disaster in our cities, which we have just not been able to figure out how to even theorize or turn it into a politics. And I was just talking to someone yesterday about how municipal sewage cleaners seem to be ending up dying so much. Even if you are not a municipal employee, if you have been doing it over generations, you know that you have to open 3 manholes at one time when you enter one in the middle, because the gas can escape from the other 2. There are people who are standing at both ends keeping an eye on what's going on, and there's a whole lot of security which is in place. When you send 2 workers and both of whom are migrants and new people into the city and don't have that family history, they don't know, and they can't in any case. They just go down, they die. So accidents on the street, sexual exploitation, lack of safety in work, all of these are direct results of cities trying to put on a sheen as cities which are very clean, at a very low cost and actually without any responsibility at the municipal level. Nahi chahiye humko responsibility. We want the credit for being the cleanest cities. Hyderabad is often considered one of the cleanest cities, right? So that's the work process has changed, and we don't quite know how to get through that to organize any kind of politics around that. So how do we structure all of this, and what do we make of this? What kind of politics can we build on this? A lot of the work that we do, whether it is in Bholakpur or with rag pickers or with the street sweepers, often ends up on questions of dignity. And that's the thing which is really, really striking for us. They are often saying that पैसों के बारे में बाद में बात करेंगे. Treat us like human beings. How do you throw burning coals on the road when you know that I am coming there to sweep that street? How do you throw broken glass on the street when you know that some woman is going to sweep that place and she probably does not have footwear? I am human, recognize me as a human being, and that's enough. A lot of the women tell you that exactly in those words, and very often. Whether you're talking to the Kabadiwala or the Bholakpur dealers or people who are working in other places, it's all the same story. Okay, I'll quickly show you the maps and then shut it down. Partha, can I take 5 minutes? So this is a map, actually a map story that we created, and the reason why we did it was that it occurred to us that we have a very aspatial imagination of waste when we talk about municipal solid waste management. So what we did was, one of our researchers went with someone who actually is a scrap dealer and went through the entire city, starting from Bholakpur, Rail Nilayam Basti, which is a very interesting place where you have a large number of rag pickers who also do the sorting right there, and the man who controls them makes sure that their housing is secure, and he's the one who makes the money from this. This is not how it works everywhere, but this is one of the ways. Now the man here, the leader, has some small time political connections. He is the one who keeps all the accounts. The first floor of his house is where some of the segregation work happens. He is the one who settles all disputes in the community, and the community needs him very badly to be able to live in the city and get some cash in their hands. He does. And often the Basti itself is named after some political party. You know, the symbology is already included in that. So Indira Nagar would mean that it's a Congress Dalit Basti. NTR Nagar would mean it's a Dalit Basti of the Telugu Desam party. So, you know, that symbology is always... Sometimes people just decide that, you know, ye nahi chalega, so we'll, from Indira Nagar will turn into Chandra Nagar or NTR Nagar or something like that, right? So those calculations are always done. Okay, then you go to Gampa Basti, which is another place where we see actually a lot of waste processing. See, what happens with plastics is that moving plastic from the segregation point to the final destination is not easy. You have to know which plastic should go where, and that's a very complicated thing, and people over the years develop the skills to bite into a plastic and tell what kind of plastic it is. If you still don't know, you know, you light it, smell the smokes, and then figure out what it is. We don't know how much of plastic actually gets coated in their lungs, but that's the way they do it. And last 2 years ago, we did a play in which they said, the way we want to describe ourselves is that we are like the Shivji. जो हालाहल अपने जहर अपने गले में छुपा के we give the rest of the good stuff to the world. So that's the way in which they tell. And what we found was that telling that story about themselves differently, that they're doing something good at great expense for themselves, that was a very important political move for them. कि हम इतना भी नहीं कर पाते हैं क्योंकि लोग सुनते नहीं हैं. So we have to have the tools. ये हम मैप हमने बनाया है, ये कहानी हमारी है और ये हम कह सकते हैं. They're dying to get opportunities like that to say that, and that in itself is a big accomplishment.
Is RSS around?
Sorry?
RSS.
Huh.
Very much.
Not in any of these. In fact, it's a strange thing. Hyderabad RSS presence is a bit small, right? They're limited to certain areas.
Because they tell these stories actually.
Um,
Communities.
This is the Muslim community. This is a completely Muslim community, which watches a lot of Hindi films.
They use the Shivji metaphor and all that.
Yeah.
They didn't have any problem. They watch Hindi movies. They said, "वो शिवजी होता है ना, वो अपने गले में लगाते हैं." So the metaphor doesn't have to have any religious connotations for them.
Hinduism.
Okay, so this is one map. The other maps that I wanted to show you, just to give you a sense of what kind of work was done. This is a timeline map of Bholakpur area. How do I? Is there any way I can zoom in onto this? Okay. So the orange spots that you're seeing in that, right? Those are the tannery areas. The blue thing that you're seeing here on left, here, that's the old industrial area. Right? So there's a logic to the way in which these locations come up. In the trash tour that I showed you, all the different locations in that, the land has a certain ambiguity about it. That's where these settlements happen. That's where the work happens. It's on the fringes of an industrial area. Its ownership is not very clear. There's a local leader who can make a claim on it and hold on to it because of his networks and connections. That's where it becomes possible for people to settle down. Bholakpur is an unusual place in the sense that it's in the middle of an old industrial estate, started in the 1930s. A major spinning mills was to its west, and to its east was a very big industrial area. Charminar cigarettes, if any of you remember, Golconda cigarettes, that's all to the east. In that area now, one big change that is happening is...
Anand, where is this in the larger area of Hyderabad?
Do you know Mushirabad?
East, west, north, south.
It's right in the middle, the central zone.
Lakes, this side of the lakes.
East side of the lake.
Okay.
So if you see the heart shape, right in the middle of the city,
Yeah.
so it's exactly to the east of that, about half a kilometer or 1 kilometer.
Okay. That's right.
Yeah.
Nice.
North south wise, east west wise, it's exactly in the middle. Just 1 kilometer from the tank mine. The metro line is coming up here. The metro line is coming up on that road which you're seeing here.
That's really interesting to have this so central. Normally it's always big.
That's because of the peculiar geography of Hyderabad, right? Bholakpur, see, Hyderabad city kind of didn't start from the center. Hyderabad city starts from the north, which is the Secunderabad and the cantonment and the villages around it. Then you have the Hyderabad city south of the river. The northern part starts coming down towards the south. The southern part starts moving to the north. So in the middle you had a big chunk of land. That periphery was right in the middle of the city actually. And that has been how it was for a very long time. Even in the 70s, the industrial belt was right in the middle because it was never meant to be one city. It's the twin cities. Secunderabad in the north, Hyderabad in the south, in the middle was the industrial belt. That industrial belt has now become completely residential. And that is where the story of sewage and fecal matter contaminating drinking water becomes a story of tanning actually having caused colitis. Because the real estate values are going up, you want to push out these people, and you have to find any excuse to say that they are killing themselves because they are doing tanning and waste work like this. So in their own interest, they should be moved out. Land should be cleared. We don't even have to say that we want the land. That's the politics. So the line that you're seeing here in the middle, this one, that's the road that connects Secunderabad to Hyderabad, one of the roads. And on that road, now the metro rail is coming up, which means to the west of it, land prices are just dying to become higher and higher, but it's not possible because of the tanneries, the waste segregation, so on and so forth. You have 20 slums in something like 1.5 kilometer stretch. And land parcels have become small enough to be like, 2 meter by 2 meter pieces. And people buy that kind of land, 75,000, 1 lakh rupees, because that's what they can afford, and that small piece of land is useful for them. You can't reassemble those tiny pieces to buy a larger chunk anymore. So there's a desperate pressure to unlock that value of land, and they're not able to figure out how to do that. And nobody knows how to make that planning intervention. How do you bring together people who are, even the old tanneries, they have all rented it out to small dealers who sell seconds goods. So it's like a large shopping mall for poor people, for weddings and so on, and people come there and buy seconds goods from this area. It's a thriving area. 2 o'clock in the morning you can go there and get biryani. Food all over the place, lots of restaurants, very, very active area. So what we did is to make a timeline of that in different layers of the map. We mapped out the community spaces, we mapped the schools, we mapped the kind of politics, where are the women working in the area, so on and so forth. So just to conclude, I think one simple thought with which we want to deal with these kind of issues is that there are a large number of people who are providing work, who providing labor that can now only be called infrastructural. It's infrastructural labor. So they're doing work that is almost invisible. You don't pay for it on a regular basis at its regular value as human labor. And that's what actually makes the rest of the economy even possible. And the only way to uncover that is to start talking about actually what is happening with those people, tell their stories, and bring them back into the numbers in a meaningful way. Which means that we need to know the spatial histories of individuals, the changing structures constantly, very, very fluid stuff. I mean, one of the new bunch of players entering this market now are people like ITC. ITC didn't want to deal with people who sell them waste paper some years ago, but they found that they're too uncouth, they can control the prices too much. So they started wealth out of waste project. Give it a green spin, go to companies and say that, large universities, and say that you give us all your waste, we will take it away, we'll even give you money, which the Raddiwala has been doing all along, right? But ITC would do that now with that corporate spin. They also get a lot of other waste. So when they go to Reddy Labs and buy paper, they're not just buying paper, they're also buying plastic, they're buying other stuff. So they're beginning to control some part of it. They have not been able to make any big inroads. There are a number of people who are trying to enter this market with startups who provide connectivity. Right? So you can go online and you can log on and schedule an appointment with an item rent buyer, which the Raddiwala would go around the street calling out. You can log on and make it, and the van will come and pick it up. None of these things have been very successful until now. We don't know what's going to happen, because it does involve millions of tiny transactions. People haven't figured out how to bundle them together as effectively as Kabadiwalas have. So, we'll stop there.